and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads.
Hi guys, it's Patrick. I'd like to talk to you today about Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. Before we get started, we're going to need a little bit of context. First of all, the Bible is not a pathway to heaven. It is a guide on how to live on earth. Second, we need a little context on Revelation itself. Ultimately, Revelation is about the return of Christ and his defeat of Satan and the creation of the new heaven and the new earth. This new heaven and new earth, this relates directly back to the first chapter of Genesis when God creates the heaven and the earth. The difference in Revelation is that man, and not God, creates the new heaven and the new earth.
Revelation chapter 12. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God, and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. In the first 6 verses of chapter 12, we have 4 different players involved. We have the woman, we have the great red dragon, we have the man-child, and we also have God. The great red dragon represents Lucifer, and the man-child represents Jesus. So there we have Christ and Antichrist. Now, why in the Bible does the Antichrist, or Lucifer, always appear before Jesus? The Antichrist appears before Christ because for humans, the ego comes first. We must conquer the ego to achieve our pure consciousness. We must conquer the Antichrist to achieve the Christ state. Verse 1. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. In verse 1, we have the woman who is clothed in the sun, with the moon under her feet, and with a crown of 12 stars. This is a representation of the Holy Trinity. The sun represents the Father, the moon represents the Mother, or the Holy Spirit, and the crown of 12 stars represents the sun. That is because the sun is the light, the moon is the vessel which contains the light, and the crown of 12 stars is the zodiac, or the manifestation, what is created within the vessel when it is filled with the light. Verse 2. And she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. In verse 2, we have the woman who is pregnant and in pain because she is pregnant. She is in pain because the Christ child is within her and it is always ready to be born. Christ represents the state in which we are manifesting God's will on earth. Lucifer is when we are manifesting our own ego will on earth. Our ego, our own selfish desires, seek to devour the Christ child as it is being born. Verse 3. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. In verse 3, we're introduced to the great red dragon, and its 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. This is all alchemical symbolism for many different things that have to do with Lucifer. Verse 4. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. In verse 4, we have more about the red dragon being the symbol for Lucifer and casting 1/3 of the stars out of heaven, just as 1/3 of the angels fell with Lucifer when he was cast out of heaven. And Lucifer here is ready to devour the Christ child. That is because the ego is always there to kill the Christ child before it can be born on earth. Verse 5. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God, and to his throne. In verse 5, we're introduced to the man-child, who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. The rod of iron has a lot of alchemical symbolism, iron being a symbol for Mars, or the male energy. It's also represented in Exodus chapter 7 by Aaron's rod, which when he throws onto the ground, it turns into a serpent. The serpent is the impure form of Mars energy, that is, impure Venus. This is all astrological, alchemical symbolism within the book of Revelation. Verse 6, And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. In verse 6, the woman flees to the wilderness, and she stays there for 1,260 days. Now, this is more biblical symbolism, the 1,260 days being a representation of 3.5 years, which, when we get to biblical time and the theories about that, we can understand that 3.5 years is also a representation for 3.5 days, which represents half of the biblical week in the first chapter of Genesis, which would be the midway point between the week of creation. So what does that midway point mean? If we look at days 1 through 3, that's the creation of earth before the sun and the moon are created on day 4. So what that means, as far as what it symbolically means, is that the first half of the week is before consciousness, and the second half of the week is when consciousness has dawned in human beings. So, the first 6 verses of the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation are before the war in heaven, before we are consciously able to defeat the ego. Okay, so now that we know what happens in these first 6 verses, we can kind of sum things up. The great red dragon represents ego consciousness, and Christ represents God consciousness. These two things are represented by the concepts of heaven and earth. These two ideas must exist simultaneously, but it is possible for human beings to purify the ego and create a new heaven and a new earth. This is the balanced state, where Christ reigns and Satan is cast into the pit. We have to understand that the ego is a necessary part of our material existence. The ego is our means of survival. Without it, we would have no instinct to protect ourselves from the dangers that surround us. Accepting Christ into our hearts and being born again is a symbol for the acceptance of the universality of consciousness, while also controlling our ego enough not to do harm to others. Creating a new heaven and a new earth is creating ourselves as a self-actualized human being. It is the cultivation and the individuation of the human soul. Thanks for watching.
Ragnarok and revolutionize.